FOMO, or the fear of missing out, is a driving force in the hobby. And it's well justified too. When a keyboard group buy is running, there is a very good chance that it'll never be produced ever again, and even if you're willing to shell out the insane markups in the aftermarket, nobody might be willing to sell. So sometimes, you just need to jump on something when it becomes available. That's why I bought this keyboard, and it turned out like, okay. This is the polycarbonate version of the Singa, purchased in one of those limited sales from a couple months ago. When I was checking out, the site said there were 11 or so in stock. I also remember there being another one of these in the past. This is a pretty alright looking keyboard. I'm not really a fan of 75% layouts and their more chunky aspect ratios, but some of that is relieved by the thin bezels. My other general complaint about most 75% boards is that grid between the number and the function row. I said this in the Vortex Race 3 review, but I think that introduces a lot of visual clutter. This is somewhat mitigated when using key sets with alternating colors on the function row, but I still much prefer some stagger or space. Still on the front face of the board, there is that blocker between the right Alt and the left arrow key. I think blockers in that particular location work well in 65% boards, but I don't really like it here. I think it probably has to do with the aspect ratio I mentioned. The chunky overall shape doesn't really complement the slim half unit of space. The other blocker is located where the left Windows key typically would be. Again, I don't like this one, but for a different reason. I don't like WinKeyless blocked layouts unless the keyboard is at least a TKL. I especially don't like 60% with them. I think they give sort of a missing tooth effect to the board. The other beef I have with these blockers is specific to the polycarbonate version. Because of the translucency, you can see right through the top, through the plate, and all the PCB holes. This to me is incredibly unattractive and just reminds me of those gaping holes in the clue board. I think it was generally unwise to make a blocked top with polycarbonate. What I find cool about this material is the machine screw holes. This is just saying to you, yeah, the board is custom, it's an expensive custom, but it's still not custom enough to have a dedicated WinKeyless plate. But this is my first polycarbonate keyboard after all. Maybe you guys like this. Last thing of note on the material, the two polycarbonate halves of the case are the same color. But because of the blocked light from the keyboard assembly, as well as the reflections from the purple PCB, the bottom takes on an almost smoked look. When you have the lights off, particularly from the rear, it can appear to be two different colors. I don't really have any feelings about this, but maybe you do. The top is high profile, the bezels come up to just above the bottoms of cherry profile keycaps. This combination of thin, high profile bezels and a relatively aggressive case angle makes this one of the rare boards where SA looks kinda good. Finally moving on, the front has the aforementioned screw holes. These are symmetrical and gives a certain retro translucent Game Boy kind of look. The same is true in the rear, where there is also a centered mini USB port. I wish they had gone with Type-C, but the expensive custom keyboard sub-community always seem to be lagging behind in that aspect. I do appreciate the position though. Here the top and the bottom pieces are flush together. On the sides there are cuts that give a little more shape. The sides follow that cut and terminates it towards the middle. This is kind of an edgy look. I'm drawn to associate this with the Asus ROG brand for some reason. On the back is the most recognizable part of the Singa, the lion weight. The face is cut using the same kind of lines found on the sides. It's a nice polygonal accent. The weight is sandblasted and coated for an oxidation-resistant matte finish. Overall, I like the design. I would have greatly preferred a WinKey version, but this was all that was available. As a matter of fact, I think I would have just preferred a no-blocker version. The top row gives 75% layouts a dense look, and you really need to commit to it. These blockers are a discrepancy. In my opinion, blockers work better on something like a Xeno or a E7V1, though I still feel kinda meh about the latter. The board can be disassembled by undoing these 8 screws on the front and rear. The first thing you'll see is the internal weight. This has the same finish as the lion's face. It's a relatively thin piece of brass, and when I got it, it was bent out of shape. This of course is pretty disappointing. Look at the top piece and you'll see that this is indeed top mounted with 8 screws, as is tradition in custom keyboards. Not much to say there. The plate is finished in the same way as the weights, and is particularly tight. It feels great with things like Cherry MX switches, but some switches like Otemu or Holy Pandas are bigger than usual, so it may be a struggle. Aside from usual problems plaguing universal layout plates, you will not have any issues with misaligned switches like in the Rama M60A. The PCB quality, at least for my particular unit, was not great. I posted on Instagram, follow me at JYMVideos, pictures that show half-detached diodes upon receipt. There I blame shipping, but I think the assembly was flimsy. Thankfully none of the pads were lifted and I was able to reattach them no problem, but while I was soldering switches, more diodes fell off from the slightest brush. I have not seen this in any other PCB, however cheap, and it's really disappointing. The other thing is that the SMD RGB LEDs for underglow don't come pre-assembled. They do include the components for you to DIY, but SMD soldering might be slightly more difficult for people who are used to through-hole. So yeah, the case doesn't have flaws, the weights don't really have flaws other than the bend, the plate looks great, and the PCB issues are nothing serious, but the experience just kind of feels like B+ stock. With shipping to the US, I paid $414. Of course, that includes a slight markup for post-group buy in-stock stuff, but I don't know, am I wrong to expect a little more? Also in 2019, I think we can expect a little more in terms of technology. Why is it that the PCB uses mini USB? Go to Wikipedia for USB and you'll see that this archaic connector is now marked deprecated. That means new products should probably not use it. I don't really care if you have fancy cables or whatever, please join us in the future. Speaking of the future, the PCB also uses Bootmapper client. While it is relatively easy to use as it has a simple user interface, it just feels old-fashioned for no good reason. Please consider QMK or VIA for future developments. I'm sure the enthusiast dropping $400 on a keyboard can figure those out. I don't really know what the composition of my audience is, but if you were like me just getting into customs, you were probably appalled at that price. $400 for a plastic keyboard? Are you kidding me? The fact is, the hype over metal keyboards is at least partly based on the false idea of weight equaling quality. In a custom case, most of the cost comes from machine time, and these are machined in just the same way as aluminum ones are. So while it might be a difficult pill to swallow, paying a lot for a machined polycarbonate keyboard isn't that crazy. Besides, there are certain subjective advantages to using this material. The least applicable for this particular keyboard is in weight reductions. This board is still pretty hefty with all of its brass parts, but in comparison to other aluminum boards, it's quite light and portable. This may be a desirable factor for some. Another reason might be for the looks. The whole craze over lighting sort of fades away as you get further into the hobby, but certain executions of it can be good. These frosted polycarbonate cases diffuse lighting really nicely. Not super well for the Singa, as there are those weights that block off a lot of the light, but the point still stands. And the transparent look is pretty cool in its own way, especially if you're nostalgic about those old clear plastic electronics. That's a little before my time though. But the most important reason that one might choose polycarbonate over aluminum is for the sound. For a given switch, there are many factors that go into the overall sound signature. A major part of this is case material, and community members claim that polycarbonate will provide a nice tone. I have installed here some Novel Keys cream switches that's been lightly lubed with Tribosys 3204. I don't have a different keyboard with the same set of switches, so I can't do direct comparisons. But in general, my impression is that the sound for this board is a lot more resonant as opposed to muted in aluminum keyboards. I think it really brings out the sound of the switch, so it may be best to leave it as is and not add any sound deadening material as you might on a metal keyboard. So do I think the board sounds better? Not necessarily. I think it sounds different, and maybe if you have a batch of switches you really took care when lubing, you'd want to put it here, so you're constantly reminded of your work. I think the dampen characteristic of metal keyboards have their place, and it is now nice to have an option for a different sound signature. Aside from sound, polycarbonate has been gaining popularity for providing a forgiving feel when used as a component in the keyboard assembly. However, the Singa just uses standard brass plates, so it's not affected by those changes. It's actually fairly firm and offers very little flex on the bottom out. In this way, the typing feel is similar to my M65A, which I guess makes sense since it also uses a top-mounted brass plate. If you take sound out of the equation, there's nothing really special about the typing experience on the Singa. which makes sense because it doesn't really try to do anything special in terms of construction. So in this familiar territory, I'd recommend going with a switch that's not silenced, probably linear, that you have some experience with. Legend has it that the designer of the Singa came up with this polycarbonate one while high on Ambien or something like that, and it's been elevated to this kind of highly desirable status, and I don't really see why. It could be because it was one of the earlier keyboards that used polycarbonate as a case material, but I think it mostly boils down to designer hype or exclusivity. In my opinion, this keyboard is fine. It's unique for its time, being one of the first in the ongoing polycarbonate craze, and it's got its merits. It's generally well constructed and looks the best it can while working with this layout. The sound is indeed different from what I know, but not so objectively better that it obsoletes everything else. This is a board that takes one risk, the case material, while staying very conservative for everything else. I guess that's good for A/B testing the effects of using polycarbonate, but I don't know if I'd assign it the kind of value that the community has.